The early modern period begins with the end of the Byzantine Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire. It also begins with the growing role of Europe in seafaring. This is the period of great explorations. We see the circumnavigation of Africa, explorers reaching India, and the sort of discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus. The Europeans achieved this through some new technologies, new ship design, improved navigation, and the use of cannon and gunpowder. The end of this period can be viewed as the period when Europe had become the dominant power in the world and it had begun the Industrial Revolution in the 1770s. This period has three major themes. The Americas were brought into the full global economic system. We see the international trade increase and the so-called Columbian Exchange, and also the use of gunpowder and other military advances to construct a new series of empires. So let's look at the second major theme, the Columbian Exchange and the intensification of the interregional trade. What is the Columbian Exchange? Well, it's basically an exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the New World, the Americas, and the Old World, Eurasia and Africa. For example, the American potato traveled from the Americas to Europe, and there it was a major contributor to the tremendous growth of population. The Europeans, on the other hand, brought the smallpox to the Americas, and as a result, the Americas lost most of its indigenous population to this disease. At the same time, the Columbian Exchange improved global food supplies. So we observe the increase of global trade, the Atlantic becomes a major trade route, and the first global commodity traded was sugar. A third major theme of this period was the use of gunpowder and other military advances to construct a new series of empires. And we see the emergence of some major overseas empires. First we have the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, and the French empires. Also, there are some large land-based empires. You can see here on this map the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire. Early modern global change produced one striking pattern, which is basically the increased pressure on human labor. This was the period when plantation slavery was used in the Americas. Also, while earlier periods were dominated by separateness, basically separate developments in individual regions, this is the period that we see the growing interconnectedness of the world, a period of proto-globalization. Connections also meant war. The 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, was perhaps the First World War. The key contenders were France and England, although there were some other European powers also involved, but France and England were the main ones. And they fought in Northern America, in India, and in Europe, and at sea. England won, and at the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Britain acquired Canada from France and Florida from Spain. Holdings in India were divided between France and Britain. So England, or the Great Britain, asserted itself as the greatest empire in this period. So this is a truly global war. The period between 1750 and 1914 is often referred as the long 19th century, and it is dominated by the Industrial Revolution. We can define the Industrial Revolution as the transformation from an agrarian-based economy to manufacturing-based economy and its associated trade. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, we see changes in process of production, in transportation, and in communication. The nature of work changes. Working in the field is no more the dominant form of work, but working in a factory is the new norm. We see new definitions of families, where families are separated by work, and also we see new roles for family members. The Industrial Revolution also changed tremendously where people lived and how they lived. We see huge movement of people from the villages to the cities. The Industrial Revolution also leads to people being able to produce huge surpluses beyond the basic material needs. And that in itself leads to a tremendous explosion of human population. Consumption increases, and we see the growth of number of specialists to satisfy these consumer demands. Industrialization first happened in England, then in Northern Europe and the United States, and eventually it happened in Japan, China, and other parts of the world. The manufacturing happened in the West, while the rest of the world provided the raw materials, at least at the first stage of industrialization. Here on this map you can see which areas were fully industrialized by 1914 and which were in the process of going through the first stage of industrialization. In dark red you can see Western Europe and the United States were already industrialized by 1914. Also you can see the building of major railroads that crisscrossed Europe, and a major railroad that crossed through the whole Russian Empire, and then railroads that connected eastern parts of the United States with the West, and also Canada and Mexico. There were two major consequences of Western Europe's industrial dominance. The first was military. By the 1790s, Western armies were gaining new advantages over Asian and African societies. We see the repeating rifles and mass-produced weapons made possible for the West to take over all those societies, and also ships and railroads allowed for the quick movement of troops, which facilitated the establishment of the Western dominance. On this map you can see the European dominance and basically European colonies established in many parts of the world. The African continent was by 1914 carved among the European powers. You can see French colonies and English colonies and Portuguese colonies and German colonies in Africa, also particularly southern part of Asia also were big colonies. The second major change in this period involved the world economy. By the second half of the 19th century, the world outside the West was producing foods, raw materials, and cheap craft products, and the West was producing manufactured products. The West prospered, while poverty in the non-Western world increased. The industrialization process also produced dire environmental effects. There was air and water pollution, urban waste, deforestation in Africa and Latin America. Workers suffered great poverty and long working hours, although conditions for workers somewhat improved, at least in Europe, in the second half of the 19th century. Slavery and serfdom worldwide were finally outlawed by the end of the 19th century. Non-Western societies also began resisting the West. They embraced nationalism and European ideology. A lot of non-Western elites went to study in European universities where they were exposed to European ideas, including nationalism. And then they adopted this ideology to fight the West, to try to win their own independence. Many historians regard the late 19th century as the beginning of globalization. The world was connected like never before. So we see that the emergence of truly global corporations in this period, with offices and production centers in different countries. And now we will look at the last period, the contemporary world period from 1914 to the present. World War I was an event that sets the beginning of this new period. It was caused by imperialistic and nationalistic impulses in the West. It was extremely destructive and it reshaped power relations. Other major events at the beginning of this period that marked the beginning of this period were revolutions in China, Mexico, and Russia, which basically led to the reshaping of societies and the emergence of new forms of government. We see the emergence of socialist governments that replace monarchies, or we also, at other parts of the world, we see the emergence of democratic governments, and also eventually we see the emergence of totalitarian governments. But by the end of this contemporary period, virtually no monarchies existed. The West remained the dominant power in the 20th century, but it is beginning to decline, and it was increasingly challenged by new emerging powers, particularly in Asia, by the emerging powers of China and India. Also, we have the rising power of Brazil in Latin America and Turkey in Europe. Some of the major events and important consequences in this contemporary period were World War I, World War II, which was basically led to the defeat of fascism and the reinstatement of democratic governments, the Cold War, which was an epic rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union after the Second World War. What was the legacy of these wars? The wars accelerated the process of redefining Western European power. World War II signaled the reduced economic and military strength of Europe. We see the emergence of two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Europe declined, its power declined, and that was represented by the decolonization in Africa, in Asia. All these three wars led to the increased power of government in many countries. Governments organized and controlled the economies, especially during World War I and World War II. And also they used propaganda to instill patriotism in their subjects. Government role expanded through much larger military spendings, and also government's responsibilities increased. Wars also challenged more traditional government structures. Empires fell, the Turkish Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they all fell, and we see the emergence of new nation states on the ashes of those empires. Wars also brought social change. As a result of these wars, women entered the workforce, and some of them gained the right to vote. And wars also promoted a broader pattern of violence, which becomes a feature of the contemporary world. And this is exemplified by the mass extermination of Jews by the Nazis in World War II, the genocides in Cambodia, Somalia, and Bosnia, which were all a product of modern warfare. The 20th century is defined by challenges to key forms central to agricultural societies: monarchy, aristocracy, and patriarchal gender relations. By the present, the dominant social class is no more the monarch and aristocracy. The dominant social class has become the upper middle class of big business owners and managers. Monarchies do not exist anymore, or there are few left, and most of them have nominal power. They were replaced by different types of governments, such as democracies, socialist governments, or in some cases, totalitarian governments. A major theme of our contemporary world is the explosion of population. People are healthier and live longer, and we have passed the 8 billion mark recently. This population growth had placed a tremendous strain on the land, resources, and the environment, and it also has led to urbanization. More and more people live in cities and not in the countryside. Also, we see new technologies in this period. We see revolution in the speed of global transportation and communication, the radio, telephone, air travel, satellite transmission, cell phone, and the internet. These are all technologies of the 20th century. We also saw the emergence of multinational business corporations. And, we are still at the beginning of the 21st century, and by living in it, it's hard to define some of the major themes because we need some distance in order to see objectively the past.